Renting an Airbnb for work trips started as a practical decision for me. My name is Mark, and I work as a contractor, mostly renovation and structural repair jobs that move from city to city depending on where the next project lands. Sometimes the work lasts a few days, sometimes a few weeks. Hotels get old after a while, especially when you're staying long enough to want a normal kitchen and a place that feels like a house instead of a hallway with a bed. Airbnbs usually solve that problem. You get a little more space, a quiet place to unwind after work, and most of the time it feels like you're borrowing someone's home for a few nights. I've stayed in dozens of them, and most have been exactly what the listing promised. That's why the house in Charleston didn't raise any alarms when I first arrived in January of 2022. The job I was working on at the time was a renovation project on an older commercial building downtown. The kind of work where the structure has been modified half a dozen times over the decades, and you spend half your day trying to figure out what the original layout even was. Because of that kind of work, I pay attention to buildings in ways most people probably don't. Floor transitions, wall thickness, how rooms connect to each other. It's not paranoia, it's just a habit that sticks with you when construction is your job. The Airbnb itself was an older 2-story house, not far from the historic district. From the outside, it looked like a lot of the houses in Charleston. Narrow lot, tall windows, wooden siding that had been repainted recently. Inside, the place had clearly been renovated to make it attractive for short-term rentals. Fresh paint, modern furniture, clean floors, simple decor. The listing photos had matched what I saw when I walked in. I dropped my bag in the living room and did the usual quick walk through the house. Kitchen, bathroom, 2 bedrooms upstairs, small hallway connecting everything. Nothing strange. If anything, the place felt a little quieter than most rentals I'd stayed in. That first night passed normally. I grabbed takeout after work, sat at the small kitchen table with my laptop, and watched a show for a while before heading upstairs to sleep. The house creaked occasionally the way older houses do, but nothing that stood out. None. The next morning, I was up early and gone before the sun fully came up. My routine during that job was simple. Work all day at the site, grab dinner somewhere nearby, then come back to the Airbnb to rest. The second evening is when I started noticing small things. Nothing dramatic, just details that didn't quite line up with the layout of the house. The first one was sound. While I was sitting in the living room eating dinner, I heard a faint shifting noise from somewhere in the house. Not upstairs exactly, not in the kitchen either. More like something moving between the walls. Old houses make noises all the time, so I didn't think much about it at first. Temperature changes cause wood to expand and contract. Air vents carry sound farther than you expect. Still, the noise repeated a couple of times over the next hour. Soft movement. A light thump once, like someone shifting their weight on wood. I paused the TV and listened. Nothing followed. I walked upstairs and checked both bedrooms just to make sure I hadn't left a window open or something loose that could be moving. Everything looked exactly the way I left it. When I came back downstairs, I noticed something else. The bookshelf along one wall of the living room looked slightly off. It wasn't something most people would catch right away. The shelf was built into the wall between 2 windows, filled with decorative books and small plants. But the base of the shelf wasn't perfectly flush with the floor. It sat a fraction of an inch away from the wall on one side. Not much, just enough that my brain flagged it. Most built-in shelves are anchored tightly into the wall studs. They don't shift or lean. I walked over and pressed lightly on one side of the shelf. It moved. Not much, but enough that I could feel it give under pressure. That was unusual. I crouched down and looked along the bottom edge. The shelf wasn't actually built into the wall, it was freestanding. Someone had placed it there to look like a permanent fixture. My first thought was that the owner had done that for storage reasons or decoration. But when I pulled the shelf forward slightly, I saw something that changed that assumption immediately. Behind the shelf was a narrow wooden door. It blended almost perfectly with the wall paneling. Without moving the bookshelf, you probably wouldn't even know it existed. For a few seconds, I just stared at it. Old houses sometimes have weird storage spaces, utility closets, crawl space, access points, things like that. I'd seen plenty during renovation jobs. Still, the door looked strange. It wasn't large enough to be a normal closet, maybe 2 feet wide, tall enough for someone to step through if they turned sideways. I stood there debating whether I should open it. Part of me thought it might just lead to a maintenance crawl space or something equally boring. Another part of me didn't like the fact it had been hidden behind furniture. Curiosity won. I pulled the shelf away far enough to reach the handle and open the door. Behind it was a narrow hallway, not a closet, an actual passage. The flashlight on my phone lit up a long strip of wooden floor, stretching away from the doorway. The hallway was barely wider than my shoulders, maybe 3 feet across. It ran straight along the interior of the house, behind the walls of the living room. At first, I thought it might just be an old service corridor from decades ago. Some older homes were built with narrow passages so maintenance workers could reach plumbing or wiring without tearing into the main rooms. But when I stepped inside and walked a few feet down the hallway, I realized that wasn't what this was. Small metal vents had been cut into the walls at regular intervals. They weren't air vents. They were positioned at eye level. And through one of them, I could see into the downstairs bedroom. The angle gave a clear view of the bed. I stepped back immediately. For a moment, I just stood in the narrow hallway, listening. The air inside smelled stale, but not abandoned. The floorboards didn't look like they had been untouched for years either. There were scuff marks along the wood. Not heavy traffic, but enough to suggest someone had walked through there more than once. I moved farther down the hallway, slowly. More vents appeared every few feet. Each one lined up with a room in the house. One faced the kitchen, another faced the staircase, another faced the second bedroom upstairs. Every major area of the house had a viewing point from inside that narrow corridor. That's when the earlier sounds from the night before started making more sense. If someone were walking inside that passage, the noise might carry faintly through the walls. My stomach felt tight as I realized something else. From the hallway, someone could move through the entire house without ever using the normal doors. They could stand behind the vents and watch any room they wanted, including the bedrooms. I turned around and walked back toward the door behind the bookshelf. Before stepping out, I shined my phone light along the floor one more time. Near the middle of the corridor, I noticed something small, a crushed plastic water bottle. It wasn't dusty. It looked recent. That bothered me more than anything else I had seen so far. If the hallway had been abandoned for years, everything inside it would be covered in dust. Instead, the bottle looked like it had been left there recently. Someone had been inside that space. I stepped back into the living room and closed the door behind me. Then I pushed the bookshelf back into place. For the next few minutes, I just stood in the middle of the room, thinking. The host hadn't mentioned anything about hidden passages in the listing. Nothing about maintenance corridors. Nothing about a section of the house that allowed someone to see into the bedrooms. I pulled out my phone and messaged the host. I kept the message simple. Hey, I noticed a small door behind the bookshelf in the living room. It leads to a hallway. Is that part of the property? A few minutes passed before the reply came. Not sure what you mean, the host wrote. It's an older house, probably just maintenance access. That response didn't make me feel any better. Maintenance access doesn't usually include viewing vents into bedrooms. I walked upstairs and looked around the bedrooms more carefully. Near the ceiling in one corner of the main bedroom was a small rectangular vent cover. From the room, it looked like part of the ventilation system. But now I knew what was behind it. A narrow hallway, a place someone could stand and look in. I packed my bag within 10 minutes. I didn't wait for another explanation. The idea of staying in a house where someone could move through hidden passages behind the walls was enough to make the place feel completely different. Before leaving, I checked the front door and windows to make sure everything was still locked. Then I loaded my things into the truck and drove away. Later that night, I contacted Airbnb support and explained what I had found. They asked for photos. I sent pictures of the hidden door in the corridor. The last message I received from the host before the platform took over the conversation was short. That hallway has been there for years, he wrote. Previous owners built it. Maybe that part was true. Old houses sometimes have strange features left behind by earlier renovations. But that explanation didn't answer the question that had been bothering me since I stepped into that narrow space. If the hallway had been there for years, why was there a fresh plastic water bottle on the floor? And why did the vents line up perfectly with the bedrooms where guests were expected to sleep? When you're on the road several times a month, the places you stay start blending together. Hotel rooms, short-term rentals, business districts that all look similar after dark. The job becomes meetings during the day and a temporary place to sleep at night before the next flight or drive. My name is David, and I work as a regional sales manager, which means a lot of my weeks are built around visiting different cities to meet clients or attend conferences. Sometimes it's just a quick overnight trip. Other times I stay somewhere 3 or 4 nights, while meetings are scheduled throughout the week. For a long time, I stayed almost exclusively in hotels. But around 2018, I started using Airbnb more often. Not for vacation reasons, just because having an actual house or apartment for a few days made business trips feel a little less sterile. You could cook a real meal, spread out paperwork on a table, maybe sit on a couch instead of a desk chair at the end of the day. Most of the rentals I used were completely normal. The one in Austin in April of 2019 looked like it would be the same. The trip itself was straightforward. I had 2 days of meetings with a distribution partner outside the city and needed a place to stay nearby. Hotels in that area were either booked or overpriced because of a big event happening downtown, so I searched for short-term rentals instead. The listing I found showed a 3-bedroom house in a quiet neighborhood about 15 minutes from where my meetings were scheduled. The photos looked clean and simple. Hardwood floors, neutral furniture, a kitchen that had obviously been updated recently. The description said the house had 3 bedrooms and 2 bathrooms and was available for full property rental. That was more space than I needed, but it didn't matter. I just needed a quiet place to work in the evenings and sleep comfortably. Check-in was easy. The host had a keypad installed on the front door, so I didn't have to meet anyone in person. They sent me a code earlier in the day, and when I arrived that evening, the house opened exactly the way it was supposed to. The first thing I noticed was how quiet the neighborhood was. It was one of those suburban Austin areas where the houses sit back from the street with small yards and trees between them. No traffic noise, no bars or restaurants nearby. Just the occasional car passing on the main road a few blocks away. Inside the house matched the photos. The living room had a couch and a television mounted on the wall. The kitchen opened into a small dining space with a wooden table and 4 chairs. Everything looked clean, organized, and recently prepared for guests. The hallway off the living room led to the 3 bedrooms. 2 of the doors were open, 1 was closed. The first bedroom looked like the main guest room, a queen bed, small dresser, nightstand with a lamp. The kind of neutral setup you see in a lot of rentals. The second bedroom looked similar, maybe meant for additional guests. The third door at the end of the hallway was locked. I tried the handle once, out of curiosity. It didn't move. That didn't strike me as particularly strange at the time. A lot of hosts keep one room locked to store personal belongings or supplies, even when a listing says 3 bedrooms. Sometimes one of them isn't meant for guests to use. Still, I sent the host a quick message through the app. Hey, just checking in. Is the 3rd bedroom supposed to stay locked? The response came back within a couple minutes. Yes, the host wrote. That room isn't part of the rental, just storage. That explanation sounded normal enough. I didn't think about it again that evening. After unpacking my laptop and a few work documents, I went out to grab dinner at a nearby restaurant and returned around 9. The house was exactly the way I left it. Quiet. Still. I spent the rest of the evening answering emails and preparing for the next day's meetings. By the time I went to bed, it was close to midnight. The bedroom I chose was the one closest to the front of the house. I shut the door, turned off the lamp, and fell asleep pretty quickly. At some point during the night, I woke up. Not fully awake at first, just that half-conscious state where your brain notices a sound but hasn't decided yet whether it matters. For a few seconds, I stayed still in bed listening. Then I heard it again. A cough. It was faint but unmistakably human. It came from somewhere inside the house. My first thought was that it might have come from outside. Sound can travel oddly at night, especially in quiet neighborhoods. Someone walking their dog or talking nearby can sound closer than they actually are. I rolled over and checked the time on my phone. 2:17 a.m. The house was completely silent after that. No footsteps, no voices, nothing. Eventually, I convinced myself it had probably come from outside and went back to sleep. The next morning, I woke up early, got dressed, and headed to my meetings. During the day, I didn't think about the sound at all. Work kept me busy until late afternoon. By the time I returned to the house that evening, the whole thing had slipped out of my mind. The second night started the same way as the first. Dinner, emails, a few phone calls. Around 10 o'clock, I walked down the hallway toward the kitchen to get a glass of water. As I passed the locked bedroom door, I heard it again. Another cough. This time there was no doubt where it came from. It was behind the door. I stopped in the hallway and stood there, listening. A few seconds passed, then I heard a quiet shifting sound. Not loud enough to be dramatic, but enough to sound like someone adjusting their position on a better chair. My first reaction was confusion. I pulled out my phone and opened the Airbnb message thread. Just checking again, I wrote to the host. Is anyone staying in the locked bedroom? A minute later, the response appeared. No, the host replied. The house is empty except for you. I stared at the message for a moment, then I looked back at the door. The house was completely quiet again. I knocked lightly. No response. I knocked again, a little harder. Still nothing. Part of me felt ridiculous standing in the hallway like that. Maybe the sound had traveled from somewhere else after all. Maybe a neighbor's house shared a wall in a way I hadn't realized. Still, the memory of how close that cough sounded the night before made it hard to dismiss. I went back into the living room and tried to focus on work. For the next hour, everything seemed normal. Then, sometime after midnight, I heard it again. Another cough. This time I was wide awake. The sound came from exactly the same place, behind the locked bedroom door. I walked into the hallway again and stood a few feet away from it. The light under the door was faint but visible. I was certain the hallway had been dark earlier. I leaned closer and listened. For a few seconds there was nothing. Then I heard a soft movement inside the room. A footstep. Slow, measured, like someone walking across the floor. My chest felt tight in a way that was difficult to explain, not panic exactly, more like the realization that something I had been trying to rationalize no longer had a comfortable explanation. I stepped back from the door and pulled out my phone again. I'm hearing someone in the locked bedroom, I typed. There's movement in there. The reply took longer this time. When it came, it was brief. That's impossible, the host wrote. No one has access to that room. I stared at the screen for a moment, then another sound came from inside the locked room. A quiet dragging noise, like something being moved slowly across the floor. That was enough for me. I grabbed my car keys and laptop from the table. Within a couple minutes, I was outside the house. The air felt colder than it should have for April, or maybe that was just the adrenaline finally catching up with me. I got into my car and drove to a nearby gas station where the lights were bright and people were around. From there, I called the non-emergency police number for the area and explained the situation. A locked bedroom in a rental property. Repeated sounds suggesting someone inside. A host claiming the house was empty. 2 officers met me outside the property about 20 minutes later. I stayed in the driveway while they approached the house. They knocked on the front door first. Then one of them walked around the side of the house while the other tried the door again. Eventually, they used a key the host provided remotely through the app system to access the property. From the driveway, I watched the lights come on inside. The officers walked down the hallway toward the bedrooms. For a few seconds, nothing happened. Then one of them tried the locked door. It didn't open. They spoke quietly to each other. Then one of them stepped back and forced the door. The sound echoed down the hallway and out through the open front door. A moment later, they stepped into the room. The next several minutes felt longer than they probably were. Eventually, one of the officers came back outside to speak with me. He didn't look alarmed, but he didn't look relaxed either. "There's no one in the room right now," he said. "Right now." That wording stuck with me. "What do you mean?" I asked. He hesitated before answering. "There's evidence someone may have been staying in there recently," he said. Inside the locked bedroom, they found a sleeping bag on the floor, a small pile of clothes, and an empty water bottle on the nightstand. The window at the back of the room had been unlocked. From the outside, it was partially hidden by a fence and a cluster of bushes. Someone could have entered or exited the room without ever going through the rest of the house. The officer asked me one more question before leaving. Did the host say this room was empty? Yes, I said. He nodded slowly, then he looked back at the house. You probably made the right call leaving, he said. I never stayed another night in that place. Airbnb refunded the booking after the police report. The host claimed they had no idea anyone had been using the room. Maybe that's true. But every time I think about that trip now, the part that sticks with me isn't the locked door. It's the fact that someone might have been staying in that room the entire time I was there, close enough that I could hear them cough in the middle of the night. Working remotely became normal for me long before the pandemic pushed everyone else into it. My name is Alex, and I'm a software engineer, and most of my job can be done anywhere. There's a stable internet connection and a quiet place to focus. Over the years, I got into the habit of occasionally renting short-term places for a week at a time just to change environments. It helps break the monotony of sitting in the same apartment coding day after day. Sometimes it's a small cabin, sometimes a beach rental, nothing extravagant, just somewhere quiet where I can work during the day and take a walk somewhere different in the evening. In May of 2020, I decided to do that in Seattle. A friend had recommended a neighborhood a few blocks from the coast that was calm but still close enough to restaurants and grocery stores. I found an Airbnb listing that looked ideal for what I needed. A small modern house with a living room, a workspace desk, and reliable internet. The photos showed a place that looked almost minimalist. White walls, clean furniture, hardwood floors, not a lot of clutter anywhere. For someone who spends most of the day staring at code, that kind of environment is perfect. Check-in was simple. The host had installed a keypad lock on the front door, and the entry instructions were automated through the Airbnb app. I arrived in the late afternoon, typed the code, and stepped inside. Everything looked exactly like the listing. Living room with a couch and a small desk by the window. Kitchen with stainless steel appliances, one bedroom and a bathroom down a short hallway. I did the usual walkthrough that most travelers probably do without thinking about it. Turn on lights, check the thermostat, make sure the Wi-Fi works. Everything functioned normally. The house was quiet too, which was exactly what I wanted. I unpacked my laptop, set it on the desk, and spent the rest of the evening working through some tasks that had piled up earlier in the week. Around midnight, I shut everything down and went to bed. The first night passed without anything unusual. The second night is when I noticed the light. I had been working late again, finishing a piece of code that had taken longer than expected. By the time I finally stood up from the desk, it was after 1 a.m. I turned off the living room lights and walked down the hallway toward the bedroom. As I reached the doorway, I noticed something small on the ceiling, a faint blinking light. It was coming from the smoke detector. At first, I didn't think anything of it. A lot of smoke detectors blink occasionally to show their functioning. Some models flash every 30 seconds or so as part of their normal operation. Still, something about the pattern looked slightly different. Instead of a single brief blink every so often, this one pulsed more regularly. I stood in the hallway, watching it for a few seconds. Blink, pause, blink, pause. It wasn't bright enough to light up the room, but in a dark hallway, it was noticeable. I made a mental note to check the model number the next day and went to bed. The next morning, I woke up and started my normal routine. Coffee, laptop open, a few hours of coding. At some point during a break, I remembered the blinking light and looked up again at the detector on the ceiling. In daylight, it didn't stand out nearly as much. The plastic housing looked like a standard smoke detector you'd see in any modern home. I grabbed a chair from the kitchen and stood on it to get a closer look. The brand name was one I recognized, but the design seemed slightly off. There was a tiny dark dot near the center that didn't quite match the pictures I remembered from typical smoke detectors. It was small enough that if you weren't specifically looking for it, you probably wouldn't notice. I stepped down and opened my laptop. A quick search showed images of the same model smoke detector. None of them had that small dark dot. I climbed back on the chair and looked again. The dot was still there, and when I leaned closer, I noticed something else. Inside the housing, behind the small opening, was a faint reflection, the kind of reflection glass makes. A lens. I stood there on the chair longer than I should have. My brain was trying to fit the pieces together into a normal explanation. Maybe the detector had some kind of sensor that looked like a lens. Maybe it was a design variation, but the more I looked at it, the more certain I became that it wasn't part of a smoke alarm at all. It looked exactly like a miniature camera. I stepped down from the chair and stood in the middle of the hallway, looking at the ceiling. The realization came slowly but completely. If that was a camera, it had been pointed directly at the hallway and bedroom entrance, which meant anyone with access to it could see into the areas where guests moved around the house. I grabbed my phone and opened the Airbnb message thread. "Quick question," I wrote to the host. "Is there a camera in the smoke detector in the hallway?" The reply came about 10 minutes later. "Absolutely not," the host wrote. "That's just a normal detector." I looked back up at the ceiling. The blinking light pulsed again. Blink, pause, blink, pause. I climbed onto the chair one more time and carefully twisted the detector housing. It came loose almost immediately. Inside the casing was a small circuit board attached to a battery pack, and mounted on that board was a tiny camera module. For a few seconds, I just stared at it. The camera was positioned so the lens sat perfectly behind the small opening in the plastic shell. From the ground, it would look like part of the detector. Up close, it was impossible to mistake. I took several photos with my phone. Then I sent one of them to the host through the app. "This looks like a camera," I wrote. The response came quickly this time. "That's not mine," the host replied. "Maybe a previous guest left something behind." I read the message twice. A previous guest leaving behind a camera hidden inside a smoke detector didn't make sense. The housing had clearly been modified to hold the device. Someone had installed it deliberately. At that point, the entire house started to feel different. I walked slowly through each room, looking at everything mounted near the ceiling. Another smoke detector in the living room, a small air vent near the bathroom door, a digital clock on the kitchen counter. None of those things had bothered me before. Now, each one looked like it might contain something hidden. I climbed onto the chair again and removed the smoke detector in the living room. Inside, it was another camera, smaller than the first one, but built the same way. My stomach tightened. If 2 detectors had cameras inside them, there was a good chance there were more devices somewhere else in the house. I didn't bother messaging the host again. Instead, I called the local police non-emergency line and explained what I had found. They asked me to stay where I was and not disturb anything else if possible. About 30 minutes later, 2 officers arrived. I showed them the detectors and the photos I had taken earlier. One of them climbed onto the chair and looked at the device himself. "Yeah," he said after a moment, "that's definitely a camera." They spent the next hour checking the rest of the house, and by the time they finished, they had removed 4 separate devices. 2 inside smoke detectors, 1 hidden in a vent cover in the hallway, and 1 inside a small USB charging adapter plugged into the wall near the bed. All of them contained tiny cameras. All of them were positioned in places where guests would spend most of their time. The officer asked if I had already contacted the host. I told him about the messages. He nodded and wrote something down in his notebook. Did the host seem surprised? He asked. I thought about the responses I'd received, then I shook my head. Not really, I said. Eventually, they collected the devices as evidence and advised me to find somewhere else to stay that night. I packed my things quickly. Walking through the house to gather my belongings felt completely different than it had when I first arrived. Every room carried the uncomfortable feeling that someone might have been watching the entire time I'd been there. Sleeping, working, walking from the shower back to the bedroom, all of it. Airbnb refunded the stay later that week and told me the property had been removed from the platform while the investigation continued. I never heard the final outcome, but even now, whenever I stay somewhere unfamiliar, I automatically glance up at smoke detectors and vents when I walk into a room. Not because I expect to find cameras, just because I know now how easily they can be hidden in places most people never think to check. When you're chasing landscapes or winter light, the best locations usually aren't near cities. They're the kind of places where you might go hours without seeing another person. My name is Sarah, and that was the reason I rented the cabin in Asheville in January of 2024. I had planned a week-long trip focused on photographing winter scenery around the Blue Ridge Parkway area. Snow-covered forests, frozen lakes, old rural roads. Those kinds of images work best early in the morning or late in the afternoon, and being close to the locations helps. The Airbnb listing looked perfect for it. A small wooden cabin outside town, surrounded by trees with a long gravel driveway, and no visible neighbors in the photos. The description emphasized quiet and privacy, which was exactly what I wanted for that kind of trip. Check-in was simple. The host, Mr. Thompson, messaged me earlier that day with the keypad code and a short note, explaining that the driveway might need clearing if heavy snow fell overnight. Otherwise, everything was straightforward. I arrived just after sunset. The road leading to the property narrowed the farther I drove from town. By the time the GPS told me to turn onto the gravel driveway, the headlights from my car were the only lights visible anywhere around me. The cabin sat about 100 yards from the road at the end of the drive. It looked almost exactly like the listing photos. 2 small windows on the front wall, a porch with a wooden railing, and snow piled along the edges of the steps where it had been shoveled earlier in the day. Inside, the place was warm and quiet. The living room had a wood stove in one corner and a couch, facing a small television mounted above a shelf. A compact kitchen sat along the far wall, and a short hallway led to a bedroom and bathroom. It felt comfortable in the way a lot of rustic cabins do. Nothing fancy, but clean and practical. While I was unpacking my camera gear in the living room, I noticed the attic ladder. It was built into the ceiling directly above the center of the room, one of those folding wooden ladders that pulls down when you grab the handle and unfold it. I'd seen plenty of those before. They're common in cabins and older houses where attic space is used for storage. Still, I sent the host a quick message. Just checking, I wrote. Is the attic used for anything? The reply came back a few minutes later. No, it's empty, the host said. Just insulation and rafters up there. That answer was good enough for me. I didn't think about the attic again that evening. The first 2 days of the trip went exactly how I hoped. Early mornings, driving out to nearby forest roads with my camera. Long stretches of quiet hiking through snow-covered trails. Evenings back at the cabin editing photos and planning the next day's locations. The cabin itself remained peaceful. At night, the only sounds were the occasional wind moving through the trees and the faint settling noises you get in wooden structures when the temperature drops. By the third night, I had settled into a comfortable routine. That evening, I spent a couple hours editing photos on my laptop while sitting at the small kitchen table. Outside the windows, the forest had gone completely dark, except for the faint reflection of snow catching the porch light. Around 11, I shut the laptop and went into the bedroom. I remember thinking how quiet the place was that night. No wind at all, just stillness. I fell asleep quickly. At some point during the night, I woke up. It wasn't a sudden wake-up like when a loud noise startles you, more like my brain gradually surfaced from sleep because something in the room felt slightly different. For a few seconds, I lay there trying to understand what had pulled me out of sleep. Then I heard it. A creaking sound. Slow, measured. It wasn't coming from the bedroom itself. It was coming from the living room. At first, I assumed it was the house settling. Cabins especially make noises when the temperature drops overnight. Wood expands and contracts. Floorboards shift slightly. But this sound didn't follow the random pattern those noises usually have. It repeated. A small creak, then another, then a faint wooden strain like weight shifting on a hinge. I reached over to the nightstand and picked up my phone. The screen lit up the room with a pale glow. 3:12 a.m. I sat up slowly and listened. The sound came again. This time I recognized what it reminded me of. The folding ladder in the living room. The hinges on those ladders make a very specific kind of noise when they move under weight. I stayed still for a moment, trying to convince myself that there was another explanation. Maybe the house shifting had caused the ladder to loosen slightly. Maybe temperature changes had affected the mechanism, but the sound continued. Slow creaking wood moving against metal. I stood up and stepped quietly into the hallway. The bedroom door was open. From there, I could see part of the living room illuminated by the dim porch light filtering through the front window. The attic ladder was partially unfolded. It hung down from the ceiling at an angle, not fully extended, just halfway open. I felt a sudden tension in my chest. The ladder had definitely been closed when I went to bed. I stood in the hallway watching it. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the ladder moved slowly again. Another small creak. The lowest section dropped a few inches farther before stopping. The movement was slow enough that it took a second to register. My first instinct was to grab my flashlight. I kept a small one in my camera bag for night photography. I walked carefully into the living room, picked it up from the floor beside the couch, and turned it on. The beam cut through the dim light in the room and pointed directly at the opening in the ceiling. The attic above looked completely black, just empty darkness between the wooden rafters. Then something moved. At the very edge of the light, I saw a hand. It appeared for only a second. A human hand, resting against the attic floor near the opening. The moment the flashlight beam reached it, the hand pulled back quickly into the darkness. I didn't think. I just stepped backward away from the ladder. The realization hit immediately. Someone was in the attic. The host had said the attic was empty, but someone had been up there close enough to begin lowering the ladder while I was asleep. And the only reason they stopped, was because the flashlight revealed them. I backed away toward the front door. The ladder stayed exactly where it was, half open, the attic above silent again. I grabbed my jacket from the back of a chair and stepped outside onto the porch. Cold air hit immediately. The snow in the yard reflected the porch light in a pale glow that made the trees beyond the clearing look darker than before. For a moment I stood there, listening. No footsteps inside the cabin, no movement from the attic, just the stillness of the woods. I walked to my car, started the engine, and turned on the headlights. Only after I was sitting inside with the doors locked did I pull out my phone and call the local sheriff's office. I explained the situation as clearly as I could. A cabin rental, an attic ladder that had started lowering during the night, a person visible in the attic space. The dispatcher told me to stay in the vehicle and that deputies were on the way. They arrived about 20 minutes later. 2 vehicles drove slowly up the gravel driveway with their lights cutting through the trees. I stepped out of the car and explained everything again while they approached the cabin. One of the deputies, Officer Miller, entered through the front door, while the others circled the building with a flashlight. From the driveway, I could see the beam of light moving through the living room windows. Then the ladder shifted again. This time it unfolded the rest of the way as the deputy pulled it down. He climbed up slowly with his flashlight pointed into the attic. Several seconds passed. Then his voice called down to the other officer. "There's space up here," he said. "Looks like someone's been using it." They later told me the attic contained a small cleared area between the insulation. There were a few blankets, a backpack, and some empty food containers. The space was large enough for someone to lie down and remain hidden. There was also a small vent opening on the side of the attic facing the woods, large enough for someone to climb through. By the time the deputies finished searching the area, whoever had been there was gone. They believed the person had slipped out through that vent after realizing the ladder had been discovered. I never went back inside the cabin that night. I packed my gear the next morning after daylight came, and the deputies returned to confirm the property was clear. Before leaving, I looked once more at the living room ceiling. The attic ladder had been folded neatly back into place. If you didn't know what had happened the night before, you'd never think twice about it. But every time I think about that trip now, I remember waking up in that quiet cabin and hearing the slow creak of wood above the living room and realizing someone had been close enough to lower the ladder while I was asleep below it. When you book an Airbnb that advertises complete privacy, you tend to take that description seriously. My name is Justin, and that was actually the reason I chose the place in Bend in the first place. At the time, I was 26 and working on my graduate thesis in environmental science. Writing it had become exhausting in my apartment because there were always distractions, roommates, city noise, people constantly coming and going. I needed a quiet stretch, somewhere away from everything where I could focus for a few days and finish a large section of the paper. Bend seemed like the perfect place. It was close enough to forests and trails that I could take breaks and walk outside, but still had stores and restaurants nearby if I needed anything. I found an Airbnb listing just outside town that looked exactly like the environment I wanted. The photos showed a small single-story house sitting at the edge of a clearing surrounded by pine trees. The listing description repeated the same phrase several times. Complete privacy, no immediate neighbors, quiet property, ideal for relaxation or remote work. The host's profile photo showed a man in his late 30s standing beside the property in daylight, smiling with his arms folded like someone proud of the place. Everything about it looked legitimate. I booked 3 nights, Check-in was easy. The host had installed a keypad on the front door and sent me the entry code earlier that day. I arrived in the late afternoon after driving up from Portland. The house looked just like the photos. A simple wooden structure with a small porch and a gravel driveway. Behind the house was a backyard that stretched into a patch of trees, and farther beyond that, the forest thickened into a darker wall of pines. Inside, the place felt comfortable, not fancy but clean and organized. A living room with a couch and coffee table, a small kitchen, one bedroom and a bathroom down a short hallway. I unpacked my laptop and a few notebooks and started working almost immediately. The quiet was exactly what I had been hoping for. No traffic noise, no people talking nearby, just the occasional wind through the trees outside. That first evening I worked until around 10 before stopping to make dinner. After eating, I sat on the couch for a while, scrolling through my phone. That's when I noticed the light. It appeared briefly through the back window, a small beam moving between the trees. At first I thought it might just be someone walking a dog or hiking along a trail behind the property. But when I stood up and looked more carefully through the glass, I realized the beam was coming from deeper in the trees than I expected. It moved slowly from left to right, then disappeared. I shrugged it off and went to bed. The next day passed normally. I worked most of the afternoon, took a short walk down the road, and came back before sunset. That night, around the same time as the evening before, I saw the light again. This time I noticed it immediately. The beam moved between the trees at the far edge of the yard. It didn't sweep around the way a flashlight usually does when someone is walking. It moved slowly, almost like someone deliberately scanning the area. I watched it for a few seconds before it vanished again. That was enough to make me curious. I opened the Airbnb app and messaged the host. "Hey," I wrote, "is there anyone who lives nearby behind the property?" The response came back about 10 minutes later. "No," the host said. "That area is just forest. I mentioned the flashlight beam." He replied again. "Probably hikers on a trail farther back." That explanation made sense. The woods behind the house could easily have paths I hadn't seen during the day. Still, something about the movement of the light stayed in the back of my mind. The third night is when things changed. By then, I had fallen into a routine. Work during the day, dinner around 8, relax for a bit before going to bed. That evening, I was sitting at the kitchen table reviewing notes when I noticed the light again. Same place, same slow movement through the trees. But this time it stayed visible longer. Instead of disappearing after a few seconds, it moved gradually across the edge of the yard before stopping behind a cluster of pines. I stood up and walked closer to the window. From there I could see the beam shining faintly against the trunks of the trees. Then it went dark. The forest returned to complete blackness. I felt a strange mix of curiosity and unease. Not fear exactly, just the sense that someone was spending an unusual amount of time in the same place, outside the house. That's when I decided to try something. I turned off every light inside the house, the living room, the kitchen, even the small lamp near the couch. The interior of the house fell into darkness except for the faint glow of my laptop screen. From outside, the windows would now look black instead of illuminated. I walked quietly back to the window and waited. For a minute or two, nothing happened. Then the flashlight beam appeared again. This time it was closer. Instead of staying deep in the trees, the light moved slowly toward the backyard. The beam slid across the ground and then up the side of the small storage shed, near the edge of the yard. My stomach tightened. Someone was definitely on the property now. I stayed completely still near the window, watching. After a few seconds, the beam shut off. The darkness returned. Then a figure stepped out from behind the shed. At first, it was just a silhouette, a man. He walked a few steps into the yard and stopped. Then he turned his head toward the house, even though the interior lights were off. I knew immediately that he was looking directly at the windows, at me. For a few seconds, neither of us moved. Then something about the shape of his face clicked in my memory. I had seen it before, earlier that week in the Airbnb listing. It was the host, the man from the profile photo, standing in the backyard watching the house. My chest tightened immediately. The listing had promised complete privacy. The host had also told me no one lived nearby, but he was standing less than 30 feet from the back door, watching. I stepped back from the window without turning on any lights. My first instinct was to leave immediately, but I forced myself to move slowly. I grabbed my laptop and phone from the table and slipped them into my backpack. Then I picked up my car keys. The front door was on the opposite side of the house from where the man was standing. If I left quietly, he might not realize I had seen him. I walked down the hallway and unlocked the door as gently as possible. The cold night air hit my face as soon as I stepped outside. I moved quickly across the porch and down the gravel driveway to my car. The engine started loudly in the quiet forest. The headlights lit up the trees around the house. For a moment, I glanced toward the backyard. The man was gone. The space near the shed was empty. I didn't wait to see if he reappeared. I drove down the gravel road and didn't stop until I reached a gas station about 10 minutes away. Only then did I message the host again. "I just saw someone in the backyard," I wrote. The reply came quickly. "No one should be there," he said. I stared at the message. Then I opened the listing page again and looked at the profile photo. Same face, the same person I had just seen standing in the yard. That was when the realization settled in fully. The host had been out there at night watching the house he had rented to me. I contacted Airbnb support from the gas station and explained everything. They canceled the remainder of the stay immediately and told me the property would be investigated. I never went back to the house, but sometimes when I think about that trip now, I picture the moment when the flashlight beam disappeared and the man stepped out from behind the shed, and the second when I recognized his face from the listing photo. The person who promised the house had complete privacy had been standing in the yard, watching it after dark. If you realized during this video that locking the door doesn't always mean you're alone, make sure you hit like, subscribe, and tell me in the comments which story disturbed you the most. But if you think houses are the only places where people set traps, the highway has a few of its own. Click now to watch 4 disturbing trucker horror stories, because sometimes the danger isn't in the house you rent. It's waiting somewhere on the road. Thanks for watching. Stay alert, stay safe, and I'll see you in the next nightmare. Honestly, if you're currently checking your smoke detector for lenses, you might as well hit subscribe while you're up there. I promise the only thing watching you from this channel is great content.